Hello everyone, and thank you for the follow, Jaquel. Thanks for stopping by. Yo, what's up? What's up to you? How are you doing? Hope your morning's going well, or whatever time it is for you. It's still morning for me, so good morning. But yeah, redeemed a stretch as well. All right. I suppose I could use one. Woke up not too long ago, after all. Ugh. But yeah, today more food history with tasting history with Max Miller. A history of ketchup. This one caught my eye. I was like, what history is there to ketchup? I gotta know. All right, let's get started.
Call me basic.
You're basic.
But I love ketchup. I mean, I wouldn't put it on a steak because I'm not a psycho, but really, French fries are just a socially acceptable way for me to get ketchup to my mouth. But would I feel the same way if I was eating ketchup 250 years ago? Like with this 1787 recipe for white ketchup from England. Who knows? But thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring my attempt to make it as I explore the history of ketchup, this time on Tasting History.
Hang on a second. White ketchup from the 17th century?
So, before we get started, I have an announcement, and it is a big one, so you're going to want to write this down. Next spring, I am publishing the long-awaited, much-anticipated Tasting History Cookbook. Ta-da! What a lovely cover! And it's actually already available for pre-order online and will be coming out on April 25th, 2023. It has some of the best recipes from the show, from Melos Zomos to Parmesan ice cream, and there will be new recipes that I haven't done here on the show yet.
Parmesan
so I will put
ice
links in the
cream.
description to where you can buy that, pretty much everywhere that you can buy books, and I will make sure to keep you updated as we get closer to the release date. But for now, let us focus on ketchup. Or is it catsup?
You like
Oh my-
watching TV shows and movies? Don't watch on that.
Go away. God damn it. You get no ad time here.
Ketchup. Ketchup. Ketchup.
Now, as the debate over the spelling of ketchup rages on, there is one debate that is settled, and that is that ketchup has tomatoes, right? Well, maybe today, but not in the past. Heck, it wasn't even always red. And this is just such a recipe for one of those off-colored ketchups. It comes from the 6th edition of The Lady's Assistant for Regulating and Supplying the Table by Mrs. Charlotte Mason from 1787. White ketchup. Take 1 quart of white wine, 1 pint of elder vinegar, and 1 quart of water. Half a pound of anchovies with their pickle, half a pound of horse...
Anchovies in ketchup? What is this madness? What parallel universe have we gone into?
horseradish scraped, 1 ounce of shallots bruised, 1 ounce of white pepper bruised, 1 ounce of mace, 1/4 of an ounce of nutmegs cut in quarters. Boil all together till half is consumed, then strain it off. When it is cold, bottle it for use. It is proper for any white sauce or to put into melted butter. A considerably well-written recipe, considering it's from the 18th century, but it doesn't hold a candle to the very easy-to-follow recipes from today's sponsor, HelloFresh. So recently, with the move and everything, I have been working
All right.
overtime to just try to catch up on videos. And so after a full day of editing or writing or whatever I've been on. Now for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 quart or 1 liter of white wine, 2 cups or 475 milliliters of elderflower vinegar. That's the one
Elderflower.
thing that is not easy to find, but you can get it online. I'll put a link to where I got mine, but you can also make your own if you have fresh elderflowers. You just fill up a jar and then put some white wine vinegar in it, and in about 2 weeks, you'll have elderflower vinegar. 1 quart or 1 liter of water, a half pound or 225 grams of anchovies, and these need to be salted or brined anchovies and not anchovies in oil because you actually need that salt, or what she calls the pickle, and it's a lot of salt. A half pound or 225 grams of horseradish, 1 ounce or 28 grams of shallots, 1 ounce or 28 grams of whole white pepper, 1 ounce or 28 grams of whole mace. By the way, that is a lot of mace. I use that amount of mace in like 20 recipes of anything else. So this has now become one of the most expensive dishes that I've ever made, simply based on some of these ingredients. They're nuts. And 1/4 ounce or 7 grams of nutmeg cut into quarters. And that's a lot easier said than done because quartering a
How is this ketchup? Well, like, seriously though, what the hell? This is an old recipe for ketchup? That doesn't involve tomatoes in any way.
nutmeg can be a tricky business because it's round, so just be very, very careful. Now first we need to bruise our shallots and white pepper. And the shallots, very clear, you just kind of mash them a little bit but don't like grind them up. The white pepper is a little different because I've never heard that term bruise associated with like a hard peppercorn. So I'm going to assume it's the same thing. She wants us to grind it but not into a powder, which makes sense because later on we're going to strain things, so that's what we're going to do. Then take a large pot and add the anchovies, horseradish, shallots, pepper, mace, and nutmeg. Then pour in the white wine, the elderflower vinegar, and the water, and give everything a good stir. Then set it over high heat and bring it to a boil. So yeah, elephant in the room, this white ketchup ain't white. I'm thinking that the name either comes from the very many white ingredients that we put in, like the horseradish, the white wine, the elderflower, and the white pepper. Or it's because she says to add it to a white sauce. And so that's actually what I'm going to do at the very end. I'm going to mix it into some bechamel, and I've already made this on the channel, so I'll put a link in the description to where I made that. But first, this needs to finish boiling. And this pot of boiling anchovies and other stuff put me in mind of one of my very first videos, and that was quick garum. And when I made that video, I was living in a little apartment and had a bunch of neighbors, so I couldn't make fermented fish sauce, which is how garum is supposed to be made. But now I have a backyard, so I do plan on making actual fermented garum. The interesting thing is, this recipe for the boiling fish that reminds me of the quick garum makes sense because it turns out ketchup got its start.
Ono Hawaiian Barbecue. Discover the thrill of the Ono Cake.
Oh my feckin' god. Oh, add part 2. Hang on.
Now, while today's recipe put me in mind of garum, the ancient Roman fermented fish sauce, the fermented fish sauce that ketchup descends from comes from much further east, from Southeast Asia, where they still use a lot of fermented fish sauce. The oldest recipe comes from the Qi Mi Yao Shou from around 544, and it tells of a Han emperor who chased these barbarians all the way to the sea. And when he got there, he smelled this interesting and very pungent aroma. He asked his emissary to go figure out what this was, and when the emissary came back, he said, "It is simply a fermented paste made from fish entrails. Take the intestine, stomach, and bladder of the yellow fish, shark, and mullet, and wash them well. Mix them with a moderate amount of salt and place them in a jar. Seal tightly and incubate in the sun. It will be ready in 20 days in summer, 50 days in spring or fall, and 100 days in winter." Later, this type of fish sauce would proliferate throughout southern China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and down to Indonesia. And the word to describe it kind of changed from language to language. One was kachap in an old dialect of Thai, or kicap in Malay. And at the time, these could refer to several types of soy sauce, some of which were made with fermented fish. Now, Dutch traders seemed to enjoy it and began shipping it back to Europe. And then in the late 17th century, British traders came into contact with the sauce as well. And by 1711, in an account of the trade in India, the British trader Charles Lockyer said that soy comes in tubs from Japan, and the best ketchup from Tonkin. Yet good of both sorts are made and sold very cheap in China. And soon after, versions...
I thought this was the history of ketchup. How do we get into fish sauce from, like, East Asia? What is this madness?
Of ketchup began appearing in recipes in many English cookbooks. The problem was, by that time, nobody really knew what was in the original sauce. And the dictionaries of the time didn't help at all because they gave definitions such as a high East India sauce. That being the entire definition from a slang dictionary from 1698. And if you are looking for a bit of a diversion later on, might I suggest thumbing through a new dictionary of the terms ancient and modern of the Canting Crew. It was supposedly written to catalog the words that were being used at the time by London's more unsavory population. And it claims it's useful for all sorts of people, especially foreigners, to secure their money and preserve their lives. It's bawdy and it's hilarious, at least to a modern reader, so I will put a link in the description to where you can read that online. But I digress. Now, with such a vague description for ketchup, it kind of left the recipe writers of England at a loss. And so they were forced to start figuring out what this sauce might be. And so lots of different recipes for both ketchup and soy sauce start to pop up, none of which have any soy in them, and I don't think any of which are fermented. While some still do feature fish, others are as diverse as walnut ketchup, a favorite of Jane Austen, pudding ketchup, which was more of a sweet and spiced brandy, oyster ketchup, pickled mango, orange juice, onions, mussels, lobster, grapes, cranberries, cucumber, apples, liver, and rum, just to name a few. There was even one recipe which called for a gallon of strong stale beer to be added with the anchovies, ginger, shallots, and mushrooms. And mushrooms are actually what became the dominant ketchup of the 18th and early 19th century. Much of those early mushroom ketchups were actually likened to soy sauce, at least in its consistency. And sometimes it was actually called mushroom soy, and then sometimes it would be mushroom ketchup. They used the term interchangeably, neither of which had any soy. But one reason that mushroom ketchup became so popular was that it kept for a very long time. One 18th century writer claimed that he had a bottle of this sort of ketchup that has been opened and set by for above a year, that has not received the least damage. And it seems that mushroom ketchup was the last type of ketchup that was okay to put on steak, because in William Kitchener's The Cook's Oracle, he begins the chapter on broiling with a poem that ends, "And for skill in such cookery your credit will fetch up, if your broils are well seasoned with good mushroom ketchup." And just like the recipe today, it's not meant to be used as a condiment, but more as an ingredient to help flavor sauces or gravy or stock. Kitchener also includes one of my favorite puns about ketchup ever. He says that those who are for a superlative ketchup will continue the boiling till the mushroom juice is reduced to half the quantity. It may then be called double ketchup or dog sup. Hilarious! And to make this wonderful pun, he has to change the way that he's spelled ketchup all the rest of the way through the cookbook. But it seems that that's okay because I found over a dozen ways to spell ketchup in the 18th and 19th century. Though by 1831, that number had reduced to 3. Ketchup, catsup, or ketchup. These 3 words indicate a sauce of which the name can be pronounced by everybody, but spelled by nobody. In this book, the domestic chemist says that true ketchup is only made with either mushrooms or walnuts. So, by 1831, the fish ketchup, the original ketchup, is now a false ketchup, as are all of those other types of ketchup, including the tomato. Now, the first tomato ketchup recipes appear shortly after 1800, and the first published recipe comes from 1812 by horticulturalist James Mees, who prefers to call tomatoes love apples. But his recipe, which had brandy and spices, was much more like a tomato.
Wait. Did he say that old guy preferred to call tomatoes love apples? Oh my god. Man, history is crazy, yo.
Sauce than anything that we would recognize as ketchup, and it didn't really take off. See, tomatoes were still coming into their own after centuries of Americans and Northern Europeans thinking that they were poisonous, something I go into detail about in my video on tomatoes. And the reputation of the tomato was a little tarnished in those first ketchup recipes because it was made in a copper pot typically, and the acidic tomato would have a chemical reaction with the copper that would become ever so slightly poisonous. Strike 1. Strike 2 came in the form of tomato ketchup's really short shelf life. Other ketchups could last years on the shelf after bottling, but tomato ketchup could last maybe months before mold and yeast began to grow. Not a bad thing if you're making it at home and you're going to eat it in a few days, but around 1837 they started commercially producing tomato ketchup, bottling it, and putting it on store shelves. So it's a bad thing when your product goes bad after a couple months, and even a worse thing when, to preserve it, you use benzoic and salicylic acid or even coal tar to help the color turn red. And in 1863, prominent food writer Pierre Blot cautioned people to beware what is sold under the name of ketchups. Many cases of debility and consumption come from eating such stuff. And another writer claimed that the tomato ketchup sold in stores was poor stuff made of dubious ingredients and the fruitful source of indigestion and other disorders of the stomach. And so bottled tomato ketchup earned a reputation for being filthy, decomposed, and putrid vegetable substances. Strike 3. But just when you thought tomato ketchup was out, and then a hero comes along. And that hero was Henry J. Heinz. Actually, he was not the only one to do this. There were several people working on the problem. He's just the most famous. And he's really not a hero, but he was very, very good at marketing.
Nope, you get no ad time here. And
The exciting world of horseradish, which, using his mother's own recipe, he bottled and sold. What made him different was that he bottled it in clear glass, and so he could tell his customers, look, I'm using clear glass, hence I have nothing to hide. His pitch worked, and the business called Heinz & Noble took off, and they started selling other things including pickles and sauerkraut, incurring a lot of debt along the way, which was a bad thing when the Panic of 1873 set in and all the creditors wanted their money back. Heinz & Noble went bust, but Heinz was not deterred. It took him a few years to get back up on his feet, but he did, and this time it was with his brother and his cousin. And they established the F&J Heinz Company. They brought back many of the old products, but also added tomato catsup to the roster. And a product with such a tarnished reputation as tomato ketchup really benefited from his whole look. It's in a clear bottle, so we have nothing to hide shtick. And it was just a shtick, because actually, it had more apples than tomatoes in it, and it included all of those preservatives that the other guy's ketchup did. And it wasn't until an executive from Heinz attended the Pure Food and Drug Congress of 1904 that the company saw the writing on the wall and decided that they would be the first ones to get rid of all the preservatives. G.F. Mason, the head of the Heinz Research Laboratory, spent a long time trying to figure out a way to make a
Heinz Research Laboratory. I never thought I'd hear such a thing.
preservative-free ketchup that would hold, and with mixed results. But it had to happen, so eventually they released one that boasted, "We do not use any benzoate of soda, any drug, any chemical, or any coloring or adulterant of any kind." Heinz new ketchup, even though it was quite a bit more expensive than any of his competitors, sold like gangbusters. And it led Heinz to become a strong proponent of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. They also changed up the recipe to include a lot more sugar, vinegar, and salt, partly to help it stay preserved for longer, and it also made it a lot thicker, and it gave us the flavor that we are acquainted with today when we say ketchup. Now, supposedly, the ketchup exiting a classic glass Heinz bottle comes out at 0.028 miles per hour. Oh, and that 57 that they use, the Heinz 57 varieties, yeah, it doesn't mean anything. See, he'd seen an advertisement for shoes and they said, "We have 21 styles," and he thought that that was catchy, just having a number associated with it, so he decided, I'll do the same thing and put 57 varieties, even though they had 57 varieties of nothing. It was just really good marketing, and really, that's what Heinz was good at, was the marketing. It was the clear bottle, the 57. And of course, changing his spelling from catsup to ketchup with a K, which at the time was a little less common, and so he thought it would make it stand out. And clearly it did, because now Heinz ketchup is the most popular ketchup in the world. And most people today spell ketchup with a K, as does the actual recipe that we're making today from 1787 for white ketchup, which is also really good marketing because the ketchup is not white. But regardless, once it's boiled down by half, strain it and let the liquid cool completely before putting it into a bottle. Now again, just as you wouldn't typically drink soy sauce by itself, you would put it into something as an ingredient to help with the flavor, I'm going to do what she suggests and put it into this bechamel sauce. And if you haven't seen that video on bechamel and the wonderful yet tragic story of François Vatel, I will make sure that that is the video that pops up after this one. And here we are, white ketchup from 1787. Okay, so before I try the ketchup in the bechamel, I'm gonna try it just by itself. It actually smells really good. It's kind of sweet, which is weird because there's nothing in there that should make it sweet smelling. This is bound to go bad. It's interesting, so it kind of looks like it should be like water, but it's a little bit thicker. Let's give it a shot. It's not sweet. Oh,
Damn. Skip.
yeah, that is not meant to be eaten alone. Whoa. Okay,
This is what happens when you don't have
salty.
YouTube Premium.
It's like concentrated flavor. I don't know what flavor. I really don't know what flavor, because I'm not tasting any specific flavor. It's all of them. It's really tangy though. That's what I'm getting now. Wow, blew out my buds. I'm gonna try the white sauce with a little bit mixed in, and it's just a very little bit, maybe like a half a teaspoon. Let's give this a shot. Now that is good. That's how it's supposed to be eaten. As she said, that is how it's supposed to be eaten. So when it's mixed with something kind of creamy and neutral, it adds this tangy zest, making it almost like a tartar sauce, but with like a weird umami, very savory note to it. That's very interesting, and I actually like it. I'm curious what it tastes like with a French fry, because that is how you're supposed to eat ketchup. Sure, that's kind of nice. So while I'm not going to be swapping it out for my beloved tomato ketchup, I do think it's pretty good. Granted, I wouldn't make it again. It's not good enough to go to all the trouble and the expense. It's very, very expensive ketchup, but it's a fun experiment. So make sure to go check out Tasting History, the cookbook, online, links in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Damn. Who knew that the word ketchup was like came from old, like was used for old fish sauces and somehow became tomato ketchup today. At the start, I was like, wait, what is this? How did we get to fish sauce? I thought this was the history of ketchup. But no, the word ketchup means a lot, apparently. Oh, I already saw that one. I was like, ooh, ancient Roman pizza. Oh, wait, I already saw that one. Ooh. The real Chef Boyardee. Yes, you have my attention, sir. Nope. You get no ad time here. Back off.
And college, I can't tell you how many times I've burnt my tongue eating an over-microwave bowl of Chef Boyardee pasta. But after years of only trying the stuff in the can, today I am making the real Chef Boyardee's recipe for spaghetti alla Boyardee. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we explore the real yet rather mythical life of Chef Boyardee, this time on Tasting History.
Yo, my man, Chef Boyardee.
Hello, may I come in? I am Chef Boyardee. Perhaps you have seen my picture on Chef Boyardee products at your grocers.
That is Chef Hector Boiardi, the real man behind the Chef Boyardee brand. And before he got into the canned pasta game, he was making spaghetti dinners for the good people of Cleveland, Ohio. And it was these spaghetti dinners that really put him on the map. And after he started his famous brand, he put out a cookbook in the late 1930s. Famous Italian Dishes by Chef Hector Boiardi, through courtesy of Stop and Shop. And I think he's playing a little fast and loose with the phrase Italian dishes, as there are recipes for macaroni tamale loaf, chili con carne, and Mexican pancakes. But I suppose what made them Italian was that he incorporated his brand of Chef Boyardee Italian sauce in all of them. Now, figuring out exactly what his original spaghetti dinners tasted like is probably not really realistic at this point. But we can get an idea using his recipe for spaghetti alla Boiardee. But while the recipe tells you how to make the spaghetti, when it comes to the sauce, the real essence of the dish, he points you to use 1 7-ounce tin Chef Boyardee Italian style sauce. Not super helpful because you can't actually get that sauce anymore. But there is a light description of that sauce in the cookbook. It says it's a combination of tomatoes, government-inspected beef, fresh vegetables, and mushrooms. Not really a recipe that we can follow. But some years back, his great niece, Anna Boiardee, put out a collection of recipes from her family, and one of those recipes was called Uncle Hector's tomato sauce. So I think that that's what we should probably use. So between the 1930s cookbook and her family's recipe, I think we are pretty much ready to make the famous spaghetti alla Boiardee, for which you will need 2 pounds or 1 kilogram of peeled tomatoes. Now you can use fresh tomatoes if they are in season. The thing is, They're not really in season right now where I live, and they would have really not been in season most of the year when Chef Boyardee was cooking, so he used canned tomatoes quite often, so that's what I'm using. 6 tablespoons or 90 milliliters of extra virgin olive oil, 1 cup of diced onion, a half cup of diced carrot, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon fresh pepper, 5 medium basil leaves sliced into strips, 1 pound or a half kilogram of lean ground beef, and a half cup of sliced mushrooms. Now you'll notice that this recipe has no garlic, which I thought was kind of odd, but it turns out the area of northern Italy where Chef Boyardee was born, well, they don't use garlic in their tomato sauce, so neither did he, at least at first. That said, if a clove of garlic happened to fall into your sauce, I won't tell anyone. So the first thing that we need to do is to make our sauce from the tomatoes. So chop them into small pieces and then put them with all the juice into either a food mill or a conical sieve. The idea is to mash them up and get all of the pulp and juice to separate from the seeds. If you do use a conical sieve, you'll want to get a pestle, a wooden pestle, because 1, it's a lot easier, and 2, if you don't have yours laying around and you decide to use a spatula, you might have to press so hard that you'll break the spatula, like I did. But once the tomatoes are sauced, heat the oil in a deep saucepan and add the chopped onion and sprinkle with about half of the salt. Then let them cook over a medium heat for about 3 minutes, and make sure the heat isn't so high that it burns the onions. Then add in the carrots and let this all cook for another 5 or 6 minutes or until the onions are soft and translucent. Then add in the meat, breaking it up into small bits, and sprinkle the rest of the salt and pepper over the meat and cook for 10 to 12 minutes or until it's no longer pink. Then comes the tomato sauce you made and the mushrooms, and stir it all together, and then raise the heat a bit so it comes to a boil. Let it boil for just a few seconds and then reduce the heat to a simmer, and then set the lid onto the pot, leaving it slightly ajar, and let it simmer for about 40 minutes. It'll start to thicken up, and it'll also just become wonderfully aromatic during that time. After 40 minutes, add in your sliced basil, stir it in, return the lid, and let it cook for another 5 minutes. So that is what Chef Boyardee called his Italian-style sauce. And before we add it to some spaghetti, let's see just how that sauce made a young Chef Boyardee the most famous Italian in America.
Nope. Go away. You get no ad time here.
So I first learned that Chef Boyardee was not only a real person, but was from Cleveland by watching 30 Rock. See, there was an episode where Liz Lemon was fed up with the work and stress of New York City, so she decides to take an impromptu trip to Cleveland, or as Jack says, flee to the Cleve. And when she gets there, there's a whole song about how wonderful Cleveland is, and it includes the lyric, "Chef Boyardee was born here, you know." Well, it turns out I do know that that is actually not true, because Ettore Boiardi was actually born in Borgonova, Italy, outside of Piacenza in 1897. He was the middle of 3 brothers, all of whom would eventually work in the restaurant industry. But for Ettore, that work started when he was around 11 at the local restaurant La Croce Bianca, or the White Cross. Now, at such a young age, he was probably the one squashing tomatoes and cleaning up, but it did help him get his foot into the door of the restaurant industry. And according to his family, in the next few years, he left Piacenza and ended up working at some fancy restaurants in Paris and London. And then at the age of 16, he boarded the ship La Lorraine from France on his way to America. And according to records at Ellis Island, he arrived on May 9th, 1914, and he was going to New York City to join his brother Paolo. Now, usually I don't look up ships' manifests to corroborate details like when young Ettore would arrive in New York, but I did for this one because basically for the next 10 years of his life, everything is kind of suspect. There are a lot of versions of what goes on. Now, I'm not saying that anything was made up, but I'm not saying that anything wasn't either. Even his family's own account of his life has a lot of holes in it, and so it's kind of difficult to tell what actually happened. And
Chef Boyardee, man of mystery. But even his family isn't quite sure what he did with his life.
I'll explain as we go. So young Ettore arrives in New York in 1914 to meet up with his brother Paolo, who had changed his name to Paul by that time, who was working in restaurants he'd come over some years before. he was working as a waiter at the Persian room at the Plaza Hotel. Very swanky, and according to most versions, he was able to then get young Ettore, who started to go by Hector, he was able to get him a job in the kitchens. And some years later, when Mario came over from Italy, the youngest brother, he got him a job there as well. So all three Boiardi boys are working at the Plaza, and this is where the story starts to show its cracks. Some versions of the story say that after just a year or so, young Hector Boiardi became the head chef at the Plaza Hotel. And is it impossible for a young teenager from Italy to become the head chef at one of the most prestigious hotels in the world? No, it's not impossible, but there's no reason to think that this actually happened. There are no records that I could find that corroborate this. So who knows? His family actually tell a different story, saying that he left the Plaza fairly early on to become the head chef at an Italian restaurant called Barbetta, which was then and still is on 46th Street. So maybe that's true. Again, I couldn't find any records to confirm or deny it, but it makes a little bit more sense. Where things really start to fall apart is when he cooked for the president. See, according to most stories that you'll find online, at the age of just 17, he was headhunted from the Plaza to go to work at the exclusive Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. And there they put him in charge of catering their top events. And one of those events was the wedding reception for then President Woodrow Wilson. And this is the story that you find most everywhere, including on the official Chef Boyardee website. The only issue is that the president didn't get married there. See, Woodrow Wilson's first wife, Ellen, died while he was in office in 1914, and the following December, 1915, he remarried, this time to Edith Galt. So there was a wedding at that time, but it was in Washington, D.C., about 6 hours away from the hotel, and they kept it very small and very quiet, partially because it had only been a year since his first wife had died, and partially because there were rumors floating around that she and the president had the first wife murdered. It's not true, but still, they didn't want any extra publicity, so very, very small affair. But regardless of the size of the wedding, it did not take place at the Greenboro Resort in West Virginia, though the president and his first wife, who was not murdered, wink wink, had actually visited that resort a year earlier, but it was at Easter of 1914, which was before Boyardee even got to the country. Slightly more plausible is the idea that Chef Boyardee organized a meal that the president held honoring troops returning from World War I. But again, the timeline doesn't really add up. That would have been some years later, and there doesn't seem to be any record of this happening, so maybe we just chalk it up to the chef's colorful origin story and leave it there. What is for certain is that at some point, Hector did leave the Plaza and around 1917 arrived in Cleveland, Ohio to work as the head chef at the Hotel Winton. Then in 1924, he and his wife Helen, who he had met in Cleveland, decided to lean into the chef's Italian roots and open their own restaurant, Il Giardino d'Italia, the Garden of Italy. And he opened it in an area called not Little Italy, but Big Italy. And very quickly, their restaurant attracted not only other Italian immigrants, but those for whom Italian cuisine was something wholly new. See, things like pizza and lasagna were fairly new in the US, and were found mostly in big cities that had little or big Italies. And spaghetti with meat sauce, well, that was a bona fide treat in Cleveland, and that is what made Chef Boyardee famous. People would come into the restaurant, try it, enjoy it so much that they would ask for an extra portion to take home. So he would wash out old milk bottles and fill it with his sauce, then send that and some uncooked spaghetti home with the people, along with instructions on how to make the meal. And those instructions are basically the instructions that you find in the 1930s cookbook that we're cooking from today. Well, the story goes that one night in 1927, Maurice and Ava Weiner, who are a couple who own some local grocery stores, come in and enjoy it so much that they ask Chef Hector if they can sell it in their store. The chef agreed, but very quickly realized that just he and his wife making this sauce in their restaurant, it wasn't enough to keep up with demand. So the next year, in 1928, with the help of his brother Mario, they established the Chef Boyardee Food Company. And they opened up a little factory in Cleveland to make the sauce. They sold 3 sauces: Italian-style spaghetti sauce with meat, a meatless mushroom sauce, and a Naples-style spaghetti sauce that had a bit of spice. And they marketed them as 3 delightful flavors, used them alternately for a varied menu. They were an absolute hit, and before long they were being sold in stores all over the Midwest. The only issue was that the customers and the people who were actually selling the sauce, who worked for the chef, none of them could pronounce his name right. So he started spelling it out phonetically, Boyardee. And unfortunately they didn't specify where the accent was, so Chef Boyardee quickly became Chef Boyardee. Now, it wasn't just sauce that they were selling, but an entire meal. Along with the can of tomato sauce, you got a box of dried spaghetti and a little canister of grated Parmesan cheese. It could be prepared in only 12 minutes and feed a family of 3 or 4 for only 29 cents. A perfect meal for a country which had just been plunged into the Great Depression.
God damn it, these feckin' ads, I swear to God.
Gangbusters, and by the late 1930s they had outgrown the Cleveland factory, and so all 3 brothers got together and moved to Milton, Pennsylvania, where they opened a new factory where they could grow their own mushrooms, and they even put out ads for local farmers to switch to tomato production. The only ingredient that they did still import was the Parmesan cheese, which they had imported from Italy, and for much of the mid-20th century, they were the #1 importer of Parmesan to the US. Now, business was going swell, and they sold nationwide, but everything...
Hang on, at that time, the Boyardee company was the biggest importer of Parmesan cheese? What? That's crazy. A single company in the US imported the most Parmesan cheese.
Changed when the US entered World War II. See, the government was not equipped to provide rations to all of the soldiers going overseas, so much of the work was contracted out to companies like Hershey, Heinz, General Mills, and Pillsbury, and of course any company who was making canned foods. That meant Chef Boyardee was going to war. Almost overnight, production shifted to make rations, and they quickly became one of the top suppliers of product for C and K rations, with dishes like meatballs and spaghetti, Vienna sausage, beef stew, and chili con carne. They even provided rations for the Soviets fighting on the Eastern Front. And to meet demand, they had to hire a lot more employees, so they became the #1 employer in the area. And supposedly, they were given medals from both the US and the Soviet government for their work in supplying the troops with food. Of course, all of the stories have different medals being won, so I'm not entirely sure what it is, but suffice to say, their efforts were appreciated. Unfortunately, with the end of World War II, also came the end of that military contract, and so all of those new employees would have to be laid off. But what's cool is instead of doing this, the Boyardee brothers decided to sell to a much larger company in order to keep everyone employed. American Home Products took over production, but Chef Hector Boyardee himself did stay on as a consultant and the face of the brand, which was great because in 1953, he got on TV.
Hello, may I come in? Chef Boyardee's products are at Best Grocers.
Ask for Chef Boyardee's spaghetti dinner. Only about 15 cents a serving.
Over the next decades, Boyardee's face was everywhere, and his meals became the #1 selling Italian food in the country. Meals like his famous spaghetti, but also ravioli and pizza, though I'm curious exactly how it tasted because it didn't have melted mozzarella, and it was really just his sauce on crust with some Parmesan cheese grated on top. It was the 50s, and food was kind of weird, so they were lucky to have any pizza at all. Now, soon after this, they added what I think is the best addition to the brand, and that is beefaroni. It was always my favorite growing up. Now, eventually, in 1978, Chef Hector Boyardee stepped away from the company, and he did pass away in 1985. Since his passing, the brand has changed hands a few times, and in doing so, they've changed the recipe of the sauce so it doesn't taste the same as when I was a kid. And it's not just because my palate has matured, it really does not taste the same. In fact, some years back, they released cans of what they called throwback recipes, which went back to the older recipe. But unfortunately, I haven't seen that around in years, so without being able to get my hands on some of Chef Hector's original Chef Boyardee sauce, I guess I'm going to just have to put the whole spaghetti dinner together myself. So the chef's 1930s recipe says to bring a gallon of water to a boil, then add 2 tablespoons of salt and 8 ounces of dried spaghetti. And he says to cook the spaghetti for 12 minutes, stirring frequently. Once cooked, strain it, return it to the pot, then add 2 tablespoons of butter and 3 tablespoons of grated Parmesan cheese. Dish the spaghetti up with the sauce on top and sprinkle with more of his grated cheese, and here we are. Spaghetti alla Boiardi, the original spaghetti dinner. We'll give it a taste. It's phenomenal. I knew it would be because it's made the whole house just smell wonderful. But it's even better. The creaminess that you get from like the butter and cheese actually on the spaghetti, really like that. It is a relatively simple sauce. There is so much flavor coming out. What I really like, so you get a lot of the herb, like the basil, but you also get a sweetness, and there's no sugar added into this. And a lot of tomato sauces now add sugar, but if you cook it long enough with good tomatoes, even if they're canned, the sweetness comes from that. So you don't need to add sugar. This is really fantastic. I will be eating this entire thing, and I'm gonna be making this again. This is actually something I would make like just cause it's a Thursday night. So go ahead, make this. It's not difficult. I'll make sure to put the recipe up on the Tasting History website, tastinghistory.com, a website that I made with help from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes building a website so easy with their dynamic tools like their drag and drop.
Damn. Chef Boyardee. Roman cheesecake? Texas chili? Soviet food of World War II. Pumpkin pie? What? Not pumpkin pie? Oh, man. Oh, Betty Crocker? Alright, you have my attention. Nope. Go away. Still not going away? You don't get ad time on this channel, bud.
Most influential bakers of the last 100 years. The thing is, she never existed. But that never stopped her from making some excellent recipes like this one from 1950 for pineapple upside down cake. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as I asked the question, who was Betty Crocker? Or, who were Betty Crocker? This time on Tasting History.
That's slightly disappointing. Like, what, Chef Boyardee was a real person, but Betty Crocker wasn't?
There are few names more synonymous with home baking than Betty Crocker, and that's because her recipes really stood the test of time, like those from the 1950 Betty Crocker's Picture Cookbook. She really had a knack for writing foolproof recipes regardless of your expertise in baking. One interesting thing about this cookbook is the way that she sets up her cake recipes. At the top of each page, there's what she calls a key recipe, which could be something like a yellow cake or a chiffon cake. Then she writes ways to modify each of those to make more specific cakes like a coconut cake or orange chiffon. So if you learn a dozen key recipes, you've really learned 100 different types of cake, which is pretty cool. One of the pages has a key recipe for upside down cake with ways to alter it to make peach or apricot upside down cake, a prune upside down cake, or the pineapple upside down cake, which is what we're making today. So for that, what you'll need is 1/3 cup or 75 grams of butter, a half cup or 110 grams of brown sugar, 7 pineapple rings, some pecan halves, and 7 maraschino cherries for garnish. Then she says to melt 1/3 cup butter in heavy 10-inch skillet or baking dish, sprinkle ½ cup brown sugar evenly over butter, arrange drained cooked fruit in attractive pattern on the butter sugar coating. So the biggest difference between her recipe and most modern recipes that you'll find is the skillet. Instead of using a cake pan, she uses a skillet, which would probably be something like a cast iron skillet, and that is going to let you get like a real nice caramelization on the fruit. So first, melt the butter in the skillet, then take it off the heat and sprinkle in the brown sugar, making sure that it's evenly spread. Then take the pineapple and arrange it on the bottom of the pan, putting a cherry inside of each ring. Then fill in the empty space with pecan halves. Also, just curious, do you say maraschino or maraschino? Because maraschino is the proper Italian, but I feel pretentious saying maraschino cherries, especially at a bar, so I say maraschino. But I guess either one works. I'm just curious, which one do you say? Anyway, once you have placed your maraschino or maraschino cherries, she says to make the cake batter. And for that, what you'll need is 2 eggs, 2/3 cup or 135 grams of sugar, 6 tablespoons or 90 milliliters of juice from the canned pineapple, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 1 cup or 125 grams of sifted flour or cake flour. Specifically, she calls for gold medal flour or soft as silk flour. And the reason that she does is because pretty much all of her recipes are a way to sell flour, and we'll talk more about that later. Now, you can still get gold medal flour or soft as silk. This one I got online because I couldn't find it at the store, and it came like taped. It's an absolute mess. But you can still get it, but any cake flour or all-purpose flour is going to work, but cake flour is going to work better. 1/3 teaspoon of baking powder and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So first take the sifted flour in a large bowl and whisk in the baking powder and the salt, and then set that aside. Then beat the eggs for several minutes until, as she says, they are thick and lemon colored, about 5 minutes. And when she says 5 minutes, she means using an electric beater, because most of these recipes were written with electronic kitchen gadgets in mind. It was the 1950s and kitchens had gone all modern, and so most of the recipes are implying that. Then gradually add in the sugar and beat until just incorporated, then pour in the pineapple juice and the vanilla and beat those in. Finally, add in the flour mixture about 1/3 at a time and incorporate those by hand. Then pour that batter over the sugared pineapples in the pan, moving it around the entire time so it's less likely to disturb the fruit. Then set it in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius. Now she says to bake it for 45 minutes, which is way too long, but she was using an oven like the one that I have behind me from, well, this one's from the late 40s, but from the early 50s, and ovens were not great. The stove part, fantastic. The oven, not so much. Modern ovens are a lot more consistent, and they're just better. So I baked mine for 30 minutes, a little bit more. I would check it at 30 minutes. It might go up to 35 minutes. And while it bakes, let's look at how this very real recipe was written by a very not real person.
Oh my god, heck off.
In October of 1921, an ad appeared on the back cover of the Saturday Evening Post. It was put out by the Washburn Crosby Company to promote their gold medal flour, and the ad was made up of puzzle pieces that you could cut out, assemble, and then mail back into the company for the prize of a pincushion in the shape of a bag of gold medal flour. 30,000 people returned the completed puzzle, but many of them were not satisfied with their pincushion. They were also hungry for knowledge, just like me. And so they used the opportunity of writing into this flour company to also ask some questions about baking. Questions like, how long do I bake my cake? How do I know when it's done? What kind of flour should I use for whatever? The kind of questions that you would just Google today, you had to write in and just hope you got an answer several weeks or months later. But at this time, the Washburn Crosby Company was not staffed to answer all of these questions. And all of the questions that were ever sent in, or any kind of fan mail for a flour company, they were answered by the all-male marketing department, and they mostly didn't know anything about actually baking. So they asked the all-female home service department, who came up with the recipes. But even with the ladies' input, the letters were still coming from men, and the head of the marketing department kind of thought that, Women didn't want to get a bunch of answers from men who had never been in the kitchen, so he decided to put a woman's name at the bottom of every letter, Betty Crocker. Betty because it was a popular name at the time and it just sounds pleasant. Who doesn't have a favorite gal pal named Betty? And Crocker because it was in honor of a recently retired and beloved executive, William Crocker, at the company. But if you were going to have people sign Betty Crocker, then the signature needed to be consistent. And so they asked all of the women who worked at the company to give them their best Betty Crocker signature. And the winner was a secretary named Florence Lindbergh, and it's still the signature that is used today. And I totally related to this because when I worked for Disney, you had to learn how to sign your character's name, like so that no matter.
Wait, this guy worked at Disney? You learn? I was not expecting to hear that just now. Damn.
Where you go in the world, Peter Pan's signature or Cinderella's signature will always look the same. Mine was Prince Charming, and I never actually had to sign it, but I was prepared. Anyway, with that signature, Betty Crocker was born, on paper at least. And between Betty Crocker's responses to questions and the added publicity of the company's not-so-subtle Eat More Wheat advertising campaign, the number of flour-related questions came flooding in. And within 5 years, the company said that because of Betty Crocker, 2 million women have learned to make perfectly delicious small breads and pastries every time they bake. Then in April of 1926, with 5 years of content, plus a bunch of recipes from gold medal cookbooks from the early 20th century, the people behind Miss Crocker invited customers to send in 70 cents, which then became $1, and in return, they would send you a little wooden box filled with Betty's best recipes. And maybe if I had thought to do that, I would have compiled my recipes into a little wooden box instead of putting them in a Tasting History cookbook. But here we are, it's on shelves, it's on my counter. Speaking of the Tasting History cookbook, I am going to be going back out on book tour in October. This time it's all East Coast. The cities are still being determined, but we're going to go north to south, hitting several cities. So if you live back there, I'd love to see you. I'm going to put details online as soon as I have them. In fact, maybe by the time this video actually drops, I'll have all those details or some of the details down in the description. So keep an eye out. Anyway, as Miss Crocker's popularity grew, the Washburn Crosby Company decided to take her onto the airwaves. They'd recently purchased a Minnesota radio station and then hired a journalist and home economist, Blanche Ingersoll, to write scripts and perform them, providing the very first voice of Betty Crocker. And in October of 1924, households all over the Midwest heard Betty Crocker say, "Good morning. This is a very happy morning for me because at last I have an opportunity to really talk to you. To those of you who are my friends through correspondences, I wish to extend most cordial greetings and good wishes. And to those of you who are making the acquaintance of Betty Crocker for the first time, I bid you welcome to our circle. This hour, 10:45 every morning, is yours, and I am here to be of service to you." And she was. Within 3 years, 12 different radio stations nationwide were broadcasting Betty Crocker. But as they didn't record radio at the time, the scripts were being read by 12 different voices of Betty Crocker. And
Nope.
in cooking tips, she also got into just general household management, how best to do grocery shopping, how best to get a stain out of a tablecloth or something, and even how best to keep your man docile. If you load a man's stomach with soggy boiled cabbage, greasy fried potatoes, can you wonder that he wants to start a fight or go out and commit a crime? We should be grateful that he does nothing worse than display a lot of temper. Now, all of these scripts for Betty Crocker were still being written by one person, and in 1927, that one person was Marjorie Child Husted, who for the next 20 years really was Betty Crocker. Not only did she provide the voice, both on paper and literally for several years, but she also crafted Betty Crocker's personality and made her have a relationship with her audience. Homemakers all over the country felt like they had a friend now when they listened to Husted's writing, to Betty Crocker on the radio. And by the 1940s, Betty Crocker was recognized in 90% of households, making her the second most recognizable woman in the country, right behind Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt had the benefit of being a real person, where Betty was not. The relationship that Husted built between Betty Crocker and her audience was something very new at the time and resembled that of Dear Abby years later in the 1950s and 60s. And similarly to Betty Crocker, Abigail Van Buren didn't really exist. It was the pen name of Abby's creator, Pauline Phillips. Now, this relationship that was built became all the more important in the 1930s during the Great Depression, when people just needed to have a calming voice to listen to and a voice to hear that people were going through the same things as they were going through. And so Betty would read letters on the air like, "My husband is just barely making a living for my 4 children and myself. He has had his wages cut terribly. I must try and do something." This allowed Betty Crocker to then teach people how to meal plan and cook on a budget. This was also an era of great change for the American home cook because of all the gadgets that were starting to invade the kitchen. So Betty Crocker, or rather Marjorie Husted, began writing the recipes to complement those new kitchens, the new appliances, and in some cases, new ingredients that weren't around even 20 years before. She also made a push for standardized size cake pans because before that, each company was just kind of making their own size cake pans. There was no 9x13. It just wasn't standard like it is today, which makes baking hard. She also took old recipes that people had on their shelves and told them how to update them for modern cooking. Since many of the ingredients and methods no longer fit the times, do not try to follow the directions given. Instead, if you discover a recipe you'd love to prepare, refer to a more current Betty Crocker recipe. And all of these changes actually saved people time and money during a time when people really needed to save money. If you're trying to figure out a recipe from 1910 before they had any kind of temperature on your oven or a lot of standardized measurements were just coming into use, and in a cake pan that is not standard, and using ingredients that maybe don't even exist anymore, you're gonna have a lot of trial and error and end up wasting a lot of ingredients. Betty Crocker helped to fix that, and people really appreciated that. But even Betty Crocker, the beloved Betty Crocker, was not above controversy. There was a period where she had bachelors on her radio show and would ask them what they were looking for in their future wife. And while many people actually really loved the segment, others did not, though not necessarily for the reasons that you'd think. "I can't say that I care much for your talks about what different men want in their future wives. Most of us who listen are married, and our husbands have got all they're going to get, unless it's some different food for which you are giving us recipes in that time. Besides, we all know they won't get what they're looking for. They'll fall in love with some pretty nitwit and won't even stop to ask whether or not she can cook." I feel like there's a lot of subtext to that letter that didn't actually make it in.
Ono Hawaiian Barbecue. Discover the thrill of the...
Oh, I swear to God. I'm just trying to watch food history.
The occasional disgruntled housewife, most people did enjoy the segment, and it actually brought in a lot of male viewers, or listeners, because it was on the radio. And some of those male listeners began sending in marriage proposals by letter to Betty Crocker. And one of these proposals actually did end up in a marriage, obviously not to Betty Crocker, but to one of the women who was writing back the letter. They actually ended up getting together and got married. And this led to a rumor in the press that Betty Crocker had gotten hitched, and so Betty Crocker, the character, had to come out and say, "No, that's just a rumor." The girl who was married was a former member of our staff, but Betty Crocker is right here as usual. Instead of practicing making biscuits for a husband, I'm afraid I will have to be content to keep doing my cooking in the gold medal kitchen so that we can work out all these recipes for you. And she did continue to work out recipes like in this 1942 Betty Crocker's Cookbook of All-Purpose Baking, which even shows her portrait for a person who didn't exist. The portrait, which was created in 1936, was actually an amalgam of several of the women who wrote on the character's behalf. Also, as this was published in 1942, it makes a lot of concessions to deal with rationing, which was happening at the beginning of World War II and throughout the war. And throughout that time, she had new recipes coming out that dealt with the ever-tightening restrictions of rations on ingredients like butter, sugar, and meat. Now, as the war years ended, Marjorie Husted, who was by that time basically Betty Crocker, was the most valuable employee at what by then was called General Mills. She was making more sales than anyone else in the company. But even though I say most valuable, she was not the most valued, as when she left in 1950, she was making 1/4 of the salary of the salesmen who were making a lot fewer sales. In a speech that she made a year after she left the company, she said, "Management is dominated by men, and there is no indication of interest on the part of employers for change." Nor did it change, at least not in the 1950s, a decade when this character that Marjorie Husted had helped craft, Betty Crocker, was at the height of her power. First, in 1950, there was Betty Crocker's Picture Cookbook, which has sold over 75 million copies and was so omnipresent in the kitchens of America that it became known simply as Big Red. The 1950s also saw Betty Crocker move from the radio to television with The Betty Crocker Show, the titular character being played by the actress Adelaide Hawley Cumming. From 1949 to 1964, Cumming played the character on a number of shows, appearing frequently on the popular Burns and Allen show.
Betty Crocker showed me how to make it with a wonderful marble cake mix.
And cake mix probably was the biggest thing to come from Betty Crocker. Rather than taking all afternoon to bake a cake, her line of cake mixes allowed you to just add an egg and some water or milk, and voila, you had yourself a cake. In fact, many of the Betty Crocker recipes after the early 50s for pineapple upside down cake don't even have you make the cake, they just tell you to go get a box of cake mix. Between the cookbook, the TV shows, and the cake mix, Betty Crocker became not only a friend of American housewives all over, but also one of the most influential bakers of the 20th century. Heck, she even invented chiffon cake, which they touted as being the cake discovery of the century, and the first new cake in 100 years. Of course, it was actually invented by a man named Harry Baker because, you know, Betty Crocker is not real. But that doesn't mean that her legacy is not real. Yes, she gets the credit, but really it was the work of hundreds of cooks over decades in the Betty Crocker kitchens who did the work of perfecting numerous recipes, many of which are still with us today and very little changed. Like this recipe for pineapple upside down cake, which should be ready to take out of the oven.
Oh my god. I don't want a Google Chromebook.
Let it cool on a wire rack for 10 minutes and then carefully flip it over and let the cake drop out, upside down onto a cake plate. And here we are, Betty Crocker's pineapple upside down cake. It smells absolutely delectable. The crumb is just lovely. It's so, just looks moist. Hate that word, but it works with cake. It sounds moist too. Here we go. Betty, you've done it again, you old gal. Wow. Can't believe I'm eating like that. It's fantastic. 70-year-old recipe. And it shouldn't change at all. You should make this in the cast iron skillet. It really does, it darkens it up so it's not as pretty, but it creates this kind of like dark carameliness. So there's, it's not a crunch, but there's a, it changes the texture, and it's absolutely wonderful, and it makes it a much more complex flavor than a lot of pineapple upside down cakes that I've had. The only problem is that I am going to eat this entire cake over the next few days. The entire cake. None of it will go to waste. It's absolutely fantastic. This recipe really does stand the test of time, and I look forward to adding it to the compendium of recipes that I'm including on the Tasting History website, which I'm building with some help from our sponsor, Squarespace. Now, while it does take a little bit of time to create a website,
Damn. Slightly disappointed Betty Crocker wasn't a real person. Uh, cucumber ice cream. Crazy, yo. Oh, decisions, decisions. Oh yeah, sweet potato coffee, I remember that. Which really wasn't. Dining on the Orient Express. Oh, haggis. History of waffles. You know what? You have my attention.
The D6.
Nope. So, how's everyone doing? As we wait for these feckin' ads.
Pack of waffles slathered with butter and smothered in rich maple syrup. But in the early 18th century, they didn't use syrup, but rather they drenched their waffles with melted butter and wine. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video, as in the words of Donkey,
I'm making waffles.
this time on Tasting History.
The words of Donkey. Making waffles.
Many historic waffle recipes are very similar to their modern counterpart. So as I was trying to find something different and unique worthy of tasting history, it took a little while, but I finally came across a recipe that I think deserves a revival, even if it's just in my personal kitchen. This recipe comes from 1714 from a collection of above 300 recipes in cookery, physic, and surgery for the use of all good wives, tender mothers, and careful nurses. And it comes just a few years before the English adopted the term waffle, because at this time they still referred to it as the right Dutch wafer. Take 4 eggs and beat them very well. Then take a good spoonful of fine sugar, 1 nutmeg grated, a pint of cream, and a pound of flour. A pound of butter melted, 2 or 3 spoonfuls of rose water, and 2 good spoonfuls of yeast. Mix all well together and bake them in your waffle tongs on the fire. For the sauce, take grated cinnamon, sack, and melted butter sweetened to your taste. What's interesting is that if you look at later versions of this same exact cookbook, you can see how the spelling of the word flour changed in a fairly short amount of time. From flour, like a flower, in 1714, to our modern spelling of flour, F-L-O-U-R, in 1746. They did use that spelling earlier on, but they could both be used kind of interchangeably until about this time. It's also written just a few years before the English took on the Dutch term waffle, and that is the one obviously that kind of won out in the long run. So for these Dutch wafers, or waffles, what you'll need is 2 eggs, 2 teaspoons of sugar, 1 teaspoon of grated nutmeg, 1 cup or 235 milliliters of cream, a little less than 2 cups or 225 grams of flour, 1 cup or 225 grams of butter, melted, and you want to use salted butter. If you don't, then add a little salt. Then 1 teaspoon of rose water and 1.5 teaspoons of dried yeast. Now they would have probably been using like ale barm, the liquid yeast that comes from making ale, but I don't have that, so dried yeast is what I'm using. So first add the yeast, sugar, and nutmeg into the flour and whisk together, then beat the eggs nice and well and whisk in the cream. Then add the melted butter and the rose water. Once everything's mixed together, add in the dry ingredients, stirring them in until just combined. Then cover the mixture and set it aside to rise for at least an hour. It should start to get either a little bubbly or a little puffy. It's a lot thicker of a batter than a modern waffle batter, so instead of bubbles it might get puffy, but you're just looking to make sure that yeast gets to working. And while it does, you can go ahead and make yourself a nice cup of coffee from today's sponsor, Trade. Trade is a coffee subscription service that helps you make better coffee at home. Basically, you tell Trade what you look for in a coffee, how you like to drink your coffee, and how much coffee is free. That is drinktrade.com/MaxMiller. I will put the link in the description. And now let us move on to our wine and butter sauce, for which you will need a half cup or 113 grams of melted butter, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1 tablespoon of sugar, and 2 tablespoons of sack. What was that? You're asking me what is sack? Well, sack is an antiquated term for a type of wine. It was one of the more popular wines of the 16th through 18th century and mostly came from the area around Spain and the Canary Islands and could actually refer to several types of wine. Most of these types of wine don't actually exist anymore, but the closest thing that you're going to get is a dry sack sherry. So get some sherry. I actually don't really like sherry on its own, but in food it seems to work. So just add the sherry along with some cinnamon and the sugar to the melted butter and whisk everything together until it's dissolved. And then set that aside, keeping it warm so the butter stays melted as you start making your waffles. Now at the time of the recipe, they would have used a cast iron waffle iron with very long handles, and the iron would sit on the hot coals of a hearth. And there were 2 types of iron. The first was this. This is so heavy, by the way, you can't imagine. This is actually made in Norway. So I'll open it up. And you can see it's very, very shallow, but it has an intricate pattern. And because it's shallow, these would make more like wafers the way that we think of them today. Very thin, very crisp, and not what we want for this. Instead, we want to use something that has the more traditional crisscross pattern that would be deeper. That's what they would use for yeasted wafers or waffles, and our recipe is yeasted, so we know that's the one to use. Now, most of us don't have a hearth in our kitchen, so you can use just an electric waffle maker, waffle iron, and that's actually what I would suggest. There are ones that go on top of the stove, and that's what I am using. It's basically meant for like camping. The thing is, there is so much butter in this recipe, so much more butter than a normal waffle today, that it melts and it starts to come out, and it starts to make little fires if you use an electric one.
Tiny Cat's lightweight.
God damn it. Oh wait, I don't even
The
have
amount
a cat.
of butter in this, you don't actually have to grease the griddle or the waffle maker at all. The butter is already there. But a little bit later, in 1907, there is a description of how to grease your waffle iron if you want. To whom is apportioned the 2 waffle irons, lights the gas under them, greases the irons when hot with a square of salt pork on the end of a fork, and cooks the first waffle. Again, you do not need to do that. You don't need to add butter or spray or anything. This has plenty of butter to make it so these don't stick. So first, heat the iron over the stove, or if you're using an electric one, which you should, then just turn it on and let it heat up, and then spoon some batter into the iron and clamp it shut. Again, this is a much thicker batter than a modern batter, so it's not really pourable, so you do kind of have to spoon it in, but it works, I promise you. Let the waffle cook for 3 to 5 minutes, and then open it up, et voila, a lovely waffle. Then we have to do this a bunch more times because we want to have a whole little stack of waffles. And so that'll give you plenty of time to make sure that you are subscribed to Tasting History, and it'll give me time to tell you about the history of waffles.
The history of waffles.
The origin of waffles really has to start with their name. One of the earliest words for them was the Old French obli, which came from the Greek obelios. And that may have referred to some sort of flat bread that was pressed between irons, though I could not find any actual evidence of that, but that's the story. Then there was the Old North French word wafre, probably coming from a Germanic word meaning honeycomb. In French, that word became gaufre, and in English it became wafer, but in Middle Dutch it became wafel. Now, all of these words at one time or another referred to something akin to waffles in many different forms. But the origin of the dish itself actually starts with communion wafers. Flat irons were used to press dough into thin bread going way, way back. but around the 9th or 10th century, we start to see irons specifically meant to make communion wafers. These would make small wafers, often embossed with a crucifix or an image of Jesus on them. As time went on, the depictions became more and more elaborate, sometimes showing entire scenes from the Bible. And as they got more elaborate, they got bigger, so that some of these wafers were like a foot in diameter. Eventually, the religious iconography gave way to more secular designs and symbols, and these would lead to a whole genre of sweet wafers throughout Europe, like the Spanish barquillo, the Norwegian krumkake, and the Italian pizzella. But during the Middle Ages, it was France where these wafers truly flourished. By the year 1200, these large molds known as moulins à oblis, or wafer irons, became a common sight in markets, and in 1270, the Guild of Obloyeurs, or wafer makers, was established. And wafers sold outside of church quickly became popular, and unlike their communion counterparts, became varied in flavor. In one of my favorite works of medieval literature called Le Ménagier de Paris, the narrator, who is ostensibly an older man who has just married a much younger woman, is teaching her how to run the household. And one of the things he says is that if you're getting ready to throw a feast for a wedding, you gotta go buy some of these wafers. For the bride's service, you must order from the oubliette maker 1.5 dozen cheese-filled waffles. A little aside, I love this work so much, and it's so interesting that it actually is one of the big inspirations for my second cookbook, which I am currently working on. And it's kind of all on the history of older cooking texts with a bunch of obviously old recipes. So yeah, it's coming. No time soon, but I'm working on it, I promise. Actually, some of the recipe testing already has begun. My Patreon patrons are helping me out with that, so yeah, it's very, very exciting. Anyway, this older work actually has some of the, if not the earliest recipes for different kinds of waffles. One is made with a traditional batter of eggs and flour, but it has wine actually in the batter. And then it says that you take some of the batter and put it on the iron, put a piece of cheese on top, and then more batter on top of that before you smash it into a wafer. So I'm assuming that this cheese-filled wafer or waffle is the one that you get if you are hosting a bride's feast. Also, the mixture is definitely thicker than today's waffle batter because it says that you can actually like knead it with your hands. So you could make it into like a ball and put it onto the waffle iron. Though there is one recipe for what he calls a pourable wafer, which I guess probably is more like a waffle batter that you would use today. But all in all, they're more like wafers than they are waffles. Now, if you're thinking that cheese in a wafer or waffle is a little unorthodox, delicious probably, but a little unorthodox, then please let me introduce you to a 15th century recipe from England for waffle or wafer. This one has all the standard ingredients like eggs and flour, and then there's sugar and ginger for flavoring. But then it says, take the womb of aluke and seethe here well, and do it on a mortar, and tender cheese thereto. So this wafer also has cheese and the boiled womb of a luca, or a pike, which is a type of fish. That does not sound great to me. But it turns out that fish-flavored waffles were very popular during Lent, though during Lent you wouldn't have had the cream or the eggs or anything like that, no butter. So it would have just mostly been fish flavored waffles, and I think that's something that is probably best left in the past. Now, with an abundance of flavored wafers coming into existence, the sellers of these wafers in Paris became quite numerous, so much so that they were having trouble all fitting in the area of Paris where the sellers were, and so they were jockeying for space, and quarrels would break out, fights would break out over waffle turf. Because of this, it's
fights would break out between waffle makers over turf. It's like, yo, this is my turf. There's only my waffles on this street. Yeah, step off. Oh my god, that is amazing.
Said that King Charles IX in 1560 had to place restrictions on the merchants, saying that they had to be at least 2 toises apart from each other, a toise being an old French measurement of about 6 feet. And on the busiest days of the year, like Easter, Christmas, and the Feast of the Assumption, they had to be kept away from the churches altogether. It was around this same time that in Belgium and Holland, they began to augment their wafer-thin waffles with a fluffier version of the waffle.
New Fresh Stacks. Here for the
Don't give a damn. Go away.
In Antwerp's cookbook, a recipe says to take white flour, warm cream, fresh melted butter, yeast, and mix together until the flour is no longer visible. Then add 10 or 12 egg yolks. With this introduction of yeast, probably from the ale-making process, like barm, then you're going to get a much lighter and fluffier waffle, provided you have the waffle maker that you need to get that type of consistency. Because if they used something like this, no matter the yeast that's in there, it's going to make a very, very thin waffle, like wafer. But if you have one that has deeper holes in it, you'll get a fluffier waffle. So I can only assume that it's around this time that we start to see that traditional grid pattern that has the deep pockets for a traditional waffle. And so it's no surprise that it is around this time in art that we start seeing waffles that look like waffles with their current grid-like pattern. And with this new waffle available, there is an explosion of different waffle recipes all around Northern and Western Europe. Some look very similar to the one that we're making today, or even to the modern waffle, but others are flavored with things like cardamom or wine or even chocolate. And throughout Europe, waffles, yeasted or not, become associated with different times of year. In England, they are associated with the sheep shearing time of year. A 16th century poem from the ploughman's feasting days says, "Wife, make us a feast, spare flesh neither corn, make wafers and cakes, for our sheep must be shorn. At sheep shearing neighbours no other thing crave, but good cheer and welcome, like neighbours to have." In Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, waffles were eaten on the Feast of the Annunciation, or March 25th. Why this happened probably has a link to just some wordplay. See, the Swedish word for the feast day was Vårfrudagen, and that sounds similar to Våffeldagen, or Waffle Day. And while the Nordic countries were celebrating the visit of the Archangel Gabriel to Mother Mary with waffles, the English colonists in America were enjoying waffles with a frolic, a waffle frolic. These were parties where, in addition to an entire meal, waffles played a key role. And in 1744, a student at Yale University named William Livingston talked about one of these waffle frolics. We had the waffle frolic at Miss Walton's. The feast, as usual, was preceded by cards. After a few games, a magnificent supper appeared in grand order and decorum. But for my own part, I was not a little aggrieved that so luxurious a feast should come under the name of a waffle frolic. It is kind of a ridiculous name, and so they ended up turning it into waffle party or waffle supper, and they remained popular though all through the 19th century and into the 20th century. They actually kept going until the 1960s in parts of America. But for me, the waffle party really hit its zenith in 1907. There was a book called Suppers, Novel Suggestions for Social Occasions, and it described how to throw one of these waffle parties, paying specific attention to the invitations. Let us have a waffle party and introduce some of the men to more intimate acquaintance with the mysteries of the cuisine. The invitations are made of cream white satin, fashioned in the exact shape and size of a waffle section, padded with white cotton wadding and tacked to simulate the meeting place of the irons. They are then scorched to the right color with a hot iron, and on them is printed in sepia tints, "Come and eat me." Delightful, with just a hint of innuendo. But it does sound like a lot of fun, one of these big old waffle parties or waffle suppers. But the meal kind of went on for quite some time with different foods, but waffles were coming out continuously because everybody invited got to be part of making the waffles. So like 2 people would be in the kitchen at all times making the waffles, so they were constantly coming out during the supper. But that's a lot of work, and I can't imagine most people would have had the time or money to do that, especially if they're also having to sew a bunch of waffle-shaped invitations. And that is why the waffle party, and pretty much everything in this book, was definitely geared toward the upper crust. To the aristocracy of America, to that much abused but very eminent class, the society women of America, this book is dedicated. Can you imagine opening a book like that today? Maybe I'm going to open my cookbook like that. I won't. But wouldn't that be so funny? Anyway, I think that these waffle parties sound like a lot of fun. They're like the more upper crust, fancier version and more work version of a pancake breakfast, which I do enjoy. Now, waffles kind of waned in popularity in France and England, but they did stay popular in both America and in other parts of Europe like Belgium, where they evolved into different varieties like the Liège waffle, which is like a waffle made of brioche and pearl sugar and is absolutely amazing. But when it comes to breakfast waffles, America really led the way with things like the invention of the electric waffle iron in 1911, the proliferation of waffle houses throughout the land, and of course, the advent of the toaster waffle. It was in San Jose, California in 1953 that Frank Dorsa developed a way to freeze waffles which could then be reheated in a toaster. These were frozen waffles, which they gave the name Froffles. Though that name did not stick, instead it took on the same name as another part of their company, which made mayonnaise with real fresh eggs.
For low prices, for...
Nope, go away. Come on. I have a video to watch here. I don't give a damn about what...
As much as I enjoy the ease of toaster waffles, and I did enjoy those original Lego My Eggo commercials,
Lego my Eggo, please.
I don't think that they ever endorsed pouring a wine butter sauce over them, like I'm about to do with these 18th century waffles. And here we are, waffles and a wine butter sauce from 1714. So
Hang on a second. Oh my god, I don't think my model was synced up. Oh, whatever. I think some settings got messed up. My mic isn't syncing with my model mouth. Oh no. I didn't realize it till just now. Oh well.
before I taste the waffles, I actually just want to try a bit of the sauce on their own. I'll kind of try them separately. Buttery. Yeah, you just get a little bit of the sherry. It's not overpowering at all. It's not like you're putting wine. It's actually really good. You know what it reminds me of is like the brandy sauce that you would put on a Christmas pudding or something like that. It's that same feeling. And now I'm going to try some of the waffle just by itself. I should use a fork. I'm using my hands. Nutmeggy. The texture is really nice, really light and fluffy from the yeast. The flavor that you get at the beginning especially is the nutmeg. And only at the end do you get just a hint of the rose water, and I think that that's a good thing, because rose water can very quickly become overpowering. Okay, now I'm going to break off a piece and pour some of this sauce on it. Here we go. That is so rich and very, very different from a regular waffle with maple syrup. It's such a different flavor, similar texture, but the flavor is something so unique that you would never find at an IHOP or Denny's today. I really like it, but I definitely don't think that it's a breakfast food at all. And it wasn't. It was more of a dessert, like a sweet treat. And that really is what it is. Those flavors are not really breakfasty flavors. I also think like one waffle is all you need. You don't really need a stack of waffles with this, because the flavors are really strong, and that thick buttery sauce is really rich. So make yourself some waffles, either 18th century waffles or modern waffles, or just heat up some Eggo waffles, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Damn, I didn't know waffles were like that old. But yeah, fucking going all the way back hundreds of years. Like, what was it, like Parisian waffle makers getting into fistfights over turf? Oh, alright. At any rate, though, that's gonna be all from me for today. thank you everyone for stopping by. Hope y'all had fun. I know I did. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you to anyone watching the VOD, and thank you as always to lovely fortune tellers watching this before I stream. Okay, let me see who's on so I can go raid. Nobody but the big shots. Let's see. I'm just start looking around. See who's playing what. AI VTuber? What, like Neuro? Hang on. Just gotta wait through this damn ad first. Still waiting through the ad. Give me a sec. Oh, I think this streamer is kind of like Neuro. You know what? I think I'm just gonna end it here without rating for like the second time ever. At any rate, but yeah, thanks for stopping by. Hope you all had fun. Thanks to, the VOD watchers, the fortune tellers. And peace out, I guess.